For example 2, part B, we want to verify the following. Secant squared x minus 1 times sine squared x minus 1 is equal to negative sine squared x. And in regards to which side's more difficult, we just have a lot more going on the left-hand side than we do on the right-hand side. So that's the side we're going to play with, and we're going to turn that side into the right-hand side. Now, something I mentioned before, and I'm going to continue to mention, is anytime you see factors of the trigonometric function squared with 1s in it, sine squared x minus 1, secant squared x minus 1, I want you to go back and think about the Pythagorean identities, because the tendency is for these to be equivalent to another value from the Pythagorean identities. Well, let's just pull these back up to remember them. The first one says that sine squared x plus cosine squared x is equal to 1. So we're going to use this one to help us reduce or simplify this one. And then we had 2 more Pythagorean identities. Let's see, the second Pythagorean identity told us that 1 plus cotangent squared is equal to cosecant squared. We don't see anything about cotangent or cosecant, so we're not going to use that one. This one says secant squared. And then we had that was the second one. The third one says tangent squared x, the third one says tangent squared x plus 1 is equal to secant squared x. So we can use, let me use a different color pen over here. We can use this one for this one. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to use we're going to use the first Pythagorean identity and the third Pythagorean identity to help us reduce these 2 down and see if we can somehow finagle that to give us negative sine squared on the right-hand side of the equation. Well, let's play with secant squared x minus 1. If you take a look at this, if we subtract 1 from both sides of those equations, then we know tangent squared x, I keep missing the n in tangent, sorry about that. We know tangent squared x is equal to secant squared x minus 1, which means we can replace this with tangent squared x. So that value reduces down to tangent squared x. Here's what we know so far. Tangent squared x times sine squared x minus 1. We have to somehow show that that's equal to negative sine squared x. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to try to reduce them down to a single term because we have a single term on the right-hand side. So let's talk about sine squared x minus 1. Well, let's take a look at the first Pythagorean identity. There is no simple fix for getting sine squared x minus 1. We're going to have to move things around a little bit. But notice that I could subtract 1 from the left-hand side, and that gives me sine squared x plus cosine squared x minus 1 is equal to 0. But I want to figure out what sine squared x minus 1 is, so I can move the cosine squared x over to the other side under subtraction. And we know that sine squared x minus 1 is equal to negative cosine squared x. All right, so we're getting somewhere. So this sine squared x minus 1, this is equivalent to saying negative cosine squared x. All right, so that first term those first 2 terms reduce down to tangent squared x. Sine squared x minus 1 reduces down to negative cosine squared x. So again, I can hope you see we're getting somewhere. We have our negative. That's very exciting news. We have our negative. All right, now let's rewrite this. So we have negative tangent squared x times cosine squared x, and we need to somehow again show that that's the same thing as saying sine squared x. Now if you ever get stuck and if you're left with a bunch of factors, rewrite those factors as sines and cosines. So tangent squared x is sine squared x over cosine squared x. Cosine squared x, well, it's already in terms of sines or cosines. We could just call it cosine squared x over 1. And watch what happens here. These factors of cosine x cancel, and we're left with negative sine squared x over 1, which is equivalent to saying negative sine squared x. There we go. We proved that this quantity that we started with, secant squared x minus 1 times sine squared x minus 1, is the same thing as saying negative sine squared x.